So if everyone is ready, I suggest that we start. So thank you everyone for joining us. The participants are getting in the conference room. We're very happy to welcome you all for this debate on equality. So the debate on equality is a cycle of conferences dedicated to the presentation of books focusing on groundbreaking findings and perspectives regarding one of the most pressing issues, inequality. And today we're very happy to welcome Esther Duflo and Abhijit V. Thank you very much for joining us. They will be presenting their book, Good Economics for Hard Times. So before I hand over the mic to Thomas Piketty and to our speakers, a quick reminder that the next sessions of the debates on equality will happen on the 9th of February for a presentation of Francesco Saraceno on the European Public Outlook, on March the 2nd, with a presentation of the recent report of the French Institute on Public Policies regarding the recruitment of students in elite schools and preparatory schools. And on March 16th, with Rafe Blaufarb presenting to us the Great Demarcation. So thank you very much. And Thomas, I'll hand the mic over to you.
Yes, I'm going to be very brief because we all want to hear Esther and Abhijit. Let me, so I don't need.
Thomas, we can't hear you.
Well, you should be able to hear me because everything seems to be on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to log out for a second and log back in because this is not working.
Okay. Yeah, Olivia, can you hear me as well? Yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, good. Okay, so, I'm going to be very, very short because, everybody wants to hear Esther and Abhijit. Let me simply say that Esther and Abhijit are actually in Paris. I've been in Paris since September, and some of you may not have realized it, because of the situation we all know. But Esther and Abhijit are, if maybe you have a higher chance to see them if you walk through a Bastille area in Paris than at PSC. But of course, I remember 3 years ago, or was it 3 years ago, when Esther and Abhijit were visiting Paris School of Economics, and we had the opportunity to see them in many conferences and seminars, and this was a lot of fun and very interesting discussion for everyone. So this year it's very frustrating for us, for them. So let's not lose time, complaining about the COVID, because, that's not going to be any useful. And let me hand the floor to Esther and Abhijit, who wrote this great book, Good Economics for Hard Times. At the time, they probably did not expect that times would get so hard that they have become since then. But that's one more reason to talk about this book. So Esther and Abhijit, you take the time you need, whether it's 30, 40, 50 minutes, 1 hour, it's not important. We are all happy to hear you. Then I will ask you a number of questions. We'll have a discussion, and then we will open the floor for the general discussion. Olivia, is there anything else we need to know before I give the floor to Esther and Abhijit, or can we start?
We can start.
Okay, so please, Abhijit.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to start, and Esther will take over from me. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. There's always an element of excitement at this point. Okay. I will now try to do a slideshow. Okay.
Yes.
So far looks good. This book in English is called Good Economics for Hard Times. And as Thomas pointed out, we were sadly prophetic here. It's one of the cases where I'd rather not have been prophetic, because we ended up with harder times than we had planned for. The book, what is this book about? The book is about all the many things that we constantly talk about. I mean, in this last month of particular drama with the U.S. presidency, which has just thankfully ended, it was kind of dominated by other things, but these are issues that nonetheless are very live. On the first day of of President Biden's presidency, he talked about immigration, he talked about social protection, he talked about climate change, and he talked about racism and discrimination, and had executive orders on all of those. So it's not a, it's he also talked about trade. So and the pandemic. So all of these are very live issues. There also happen to be the issues that are, all of these in some form or the other are very much core to the field of economics. So it's in a sense you would think that economists would feel very relevant at this point, and yet nobody's listening to them. This table is from the UK, from a YouGov survey, but we did a survey in the US which has very similar results, very similar. Um, it's basically asking, do you trust a person in profession X to be, you know, to give competent or correct opinions when they talk about their own field of expertise. So this is not nurses talking about economics. It's not economists talking about nursing. It's economists talking about economics and nurses talking about nursing. You can see the nurses are trusted, doctors are trusted, scientists are trusted, historians are trusted, weather forecasters get more than 50%. Civil servants are just above economists, and economists are the only people who do worse than economists are politicians. That's a very depressing, for multiple reasons, because in some ways I'm going to come back to this question of trust in politicians as being a core issue as well. We'll come back to that in the course of this talk, and it's a central theme in the book, that trust in economists and trust in politicians are both absolutely central to any attempt to put societies back together from where they are. One of the reasons why this is the case is that there is some disagreement, and I think that that disagreement we don't take seriously enough, because we somehow believe that we're right. So this is one from a question from a poll that to a group which is called the IGM Booth, I don't know, panel, and it's a panel that I'm also a part of, and it has I don't know 50-60 economists who are asked every few week or 10 days a question, and they're asked kind of to give their opinion. So this is a question on which no economist said tariffs will make Americans better off. And 33% of people in our poll said so. So as I said, we have a poll of more or less representative poll of Americans, and there you find is 33% who think this is a good idea. So that's a kind of a number that keeps cropping up, which is that there is economists seem to agree with each other, but and this is absolutely a question of economic where economics should have a reasonable chance of being right, but there's still substantial disagreement here. Here's another one that looks more familiar probably. This is and here I think the theory is a bit clearer. So again, this is as you can see, it's about the sort of carbon taxes. Almost economists, unless they happen to be kind of mad libertarians, are for carbon taxes, and even that is less and less true. There are very few exceptions to this. Most economists have carbon taxes. This is an articulation by the Gilets jaunes of why they don't like carbon taxes, and you can see that they are alleging that the carbon taxes are basically a way to tax the poor to subsidize the rich. This is not entirely unfair, as those of you who follow French fiscal policy know. This policy was accompanied by was very close in time to removal of wealth taxes and other impositions on the rich. So you do them together, people make a connection between them quite quickly. So I think that there's one general problem that this is highlighting, which is that economists are often seen as being when economists say this is good for the economy or good for well-being, the suspicion is often that this means well-being of a particular group of people. That's not entirely, unfortunately, unfair. That's not entirely unfair. I'm going to come back to this. This is Milton Friedman. This is 50 years ago. He declared, and we have had a hard time living it down since then. Milton Friedman, for those of you who are young and too young to know who he is, was one of the icons of right-wing economics. One of the people who has kind of made economics the way it is, for better and worse, probably mostly for worse. And this is one of his more famous quotes. And that particular set of political stances, which we have inherited, whether we like it or not, they're associated with us. So people are suspicious. One reason they're suspicious is that they think we must be, when we say this is good for the economy, they read this is good for rich people. So that, I think that's a ongoing challenge we have. Another one, which is is more embarrassing in a sense, is that we're just wrong a lot. This is a graphic produced by the International Monetary Fund, which is not known for its communist views, let's say. So it's a very much a sort of center right organization with a lot of kind of stake in the current world economy being the way it is. And you can see that essentially the IMF, in its predictions of what's about to happen, in the in the world, they tend to, if you think about, a year before, April of the year before the recession happens, their predicted growth is usually 3%. That goes down a little, but still very positive by the by the October of that year. In April, they're still thinking of zero growth essentially, and you have to be well into the middle of a recession before economists actually can see that there's a recession going on. And this probably warrants the quote that is at the bottom of the slide, which you can read. It doesn't help that there was a recent controversy where the Black Lives Matter movement was criticized by an editor of a top economics journal for in a what can be at least described as being a major case of overstep, if not actual embarrassing idiocy. But I would say that this was a this highlighted the fact that, prominent economists have, pretty awful views sometimes. So that's that, incompetence plus these kinds of views doesn't help us. It doesn't particularly, particularly serve serve our own image if the way what we practice. Nonetheless, I would say that it would be hard for me to accept, maybe I'm biased, that economists should just give up, do something else. Histories historians have much higher rating, so maybe something else. Esther was about to be a historian. She got persuaded by Thomas to be an economist, and look what happened to her. She's now in the 25%, rather. She would have been in the 71%. She is now in the 25% group. I think this is not actually. I mean, I'm obviously biased, but I don't think that's actually. This is actually fair. Economics right now is a very different profession from what it was 50 years ago. It's much more open to questions of distribution. It's much more open to questions of the knee-jerk reactions to sort of questions of economic policy are much more muted. People now actually rely on evidence, and I'll show you in a minute that the evidence sometimes doesn't say what kind of economics 101 says. So I think economics has moved a long way from where this was, where it was. It's not an accident that the person who was in that particular kerfuffle on Black Lives Matter was in the direct line of Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. I think mostly economics has become quite different, and even at the University of Chicago, it's a very different place now than when I first went there. So I think that, and that's reflected on the fact that economists actually, a lot of what we do is very, very hands-on, kind of solve a problem kinds of research. If you look at what happened right after COVID-19, there was just a rush of people into doing very useful, mundane research. Is this COVID-19 leading to children missing their other vaccines, and therefore is it actually creating a higher burden of disease? These are the kind of questions that nobody else asks, but I think those questions are critical in understanding, is the impact of COVID-19 in some poor countries enough to warrant the 9 months of school closure that happened. So all kinds of questions which are quite practical, and where I think economists, by precisely making those connections, can have useful things to say. And continuing that point, if you look at the way the journals function now, there's actually a lot of work on, for example, racism, despite the sort of perception that maybe economists are not interested in such issues. So I do think that overall economics has moved to a place where it can be very useful. It's not always perceived that way, as you know, but it's also, and that's partly because we haven't done a very good job of presenting ourselves, I would say. That's not the only reason, but we also don't do a very good job of explaining why we take the positions we do, why carbon taxes make sense, what and why there means, what is the context, what is the prior assumptions about compensatory transfers, etc., that make carbon taxes legitimate. And because partly we seem to, are okay with leaving their job half done. We're okay with removing tariffs but not compensating the losers. We're okay with removing carbon taxes but not compensating the losers. I think we are somewhat appropriately blamed for it. It's not that we don't know that these things are important. It's not that we don't tell each other that the transfers have to be made, but somehow we don't speak up enough in the public domain. One of the reasons we wrote this book was to speak up. I'm going to speak a little bit more and then pass it on to Esther. So this is continuing what I said right at the beginning. One of the other things that you can see in the world is a decline in trust. This is OECD. Trust in government has gone down by a very substantial amount just over the last 15 years. Actually, this is in 2014, but there's no good news to be had since, especially in countries like the US. So trust in government has gone down. And I think there's a broader and sometimes comic sort of disdain for the government. This particular example, for those of you who don't know the US, Medicare is a government program. It is the government program for the elderly. It is publicly funded. Uh, so when somebody says keep the government out of my Medicare, it's you can see that people aren't particularly concerned about the nuances of this. This is more a gesture, or the government is a punching bag. And yet, we know at this moment that the government is critical. I mean, if you think about the things that the government did and is doing now, you see that the government enforced a set of mandates about shutting down businesses, wearing masks. All of these are externalities. Each of these affects people who are in the business, but also people who are going to be his clients, people are going to walking on the street to go to those businesses, etc. And so, and then the flip side of that is that when I shut down the businesses in order to save people from getting COVID, the businesses suffer, so they need compensation. That was vaccines needed to be developed, and they were developed even though we hear a lot about Pfizer and Moderna. Both of these vaccines were actually developed on the back of something that the NIH, the National Institute of Health, a government-funded, developed. So this is the most of the science of these vaccines was being developed in the NIH, and then it turned out that these two companies were able to piggyback on that, and they did a wonderful job. But it's still true that this was government-funded science. And finally, right now, the government is deciding who gets the vaccine. And here, the government in most countries is, I think, avoiding the obvious mistake of letting the market do it. The market cannot do it. The market will get it to the rich people, not the people who need it. So I think that all of this makes it very clear that we need the government. And this is a correlation. You can make what you want of it, but in terms of deaths per 1,000 population of COVID, places with low trust in government did very badly. Ones with high trust in government, whether they or not they should have trust in government, did very well. And you can see that the very clear downward slope in that curve. So I think I think this going back to the theme I was already alluding to, and which Esther will pick up now. I think one of the critical pieces of the story that if economics has to regain its legitimacy, and indeed governments have to regain their legitimacy, because governments have often been driven precisely by economic ideologies. Esther will mention some as we, in a minute. Those ideologies, if we want to surmount that particular problem, the fact that nobody trusts us, well, the critical piece of that is the government has to be able to make transfers. For that, the government needs to both, in many countries at least, raise much more revenue and make much bigger transfers. Part of the reason that doesn't happen, and this is very consistent with Thomas Piketty's work, that the poor actually are very suspicious of all of these programs. The right is often are people who would benefit from these transfers, but they're against it. The politics, therefore, doesn't allow it. So trust in government, and at the heart of that is the idea that the government will screw it up in one way or the other. It'll give it to the wrong people. It will waste the money. And I think those are very powerful myths that have been planted very effectively in many societies, and it's time in some sense to undo those. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Esther. I'm going to stop sharing, and then she can share.
I'm going to share. So what we're doing today, trying to do today, is to take some of the lessons that we have from the book, not on any particular topic, but more the type of ideas that seems to run through whatever the topic is about, and to see whether they are, to kind of think to ourselves whether they are still valid in our harder times. So the first one is what Abhijit talked about, is the importance of the trust in governments, and the very deleterious effect that there is in many countries, which has formed a sort of a self-sustaining prophecy of mistrust in governments. And in part, this mistrust in government is coming from this some of economic misconceptions that have been running around, including in government. And one of them is the belief that people are extremely sensitive to financial incentives, and which you see in various ways. So that the rich, you cannot tax the rich because they would stop working. You cannot give transfer to the poor because they would stop working. There is also, if we only open our border, we would immediately be flooded by a huge number of people because they would be attracted by the better condition of lives. So at the heart of all of these views is the same idea that people are that purely economic incentives are a very powerful driver of what we do. And it turns out that in all of these applications, the response to taxation, the response to transfers for the poor, the response to migration to economic circumstances, the effects of the economic incentives are much lower than we typically think. I'll give you just one example for today, focusing on the response to social transfer. So one powerful idea that really exists at the heart of a lot of social protection systems around the world, poor countries and rich countries, is that you should not make it comfortable. So the original social protection system of the Victorian era were like prisons. People, if they needed help, were put into extremely uncomfortable situations. And the idea was that you should not make it comfortable, so people really have an incentive to escape. We don't put poor people in prison. At least sometimes we do, but not on the face of it. We don't put poor people in prison just because they're poor. But we do try. A lot of social protection systems around the world are trying to put to have people jump through various hoops to make sure that it's not too comfortable, so that they preserve. There is a big incentive in going back to work to find new jobs, and so the empirical question is it the case that when being poor is not as terrible, people become figure out that they don't need to make an effort to work? And it turns out we have a pretty good answer for these questions for a lot of countries which have put in place cash transfers towards their poor people, which are either unconditional or conditional on things that have nothing to do with work. For example, conditional on sending your kids to school or getting immunization for them and so on and so forth. And what we're seeing and a lot of these programs have been evaluated with randomized control trials. So you have very similar groups. Some of them got the money, some of them didn't get the money. And I'm showing you one graph here that Abhijit and co-author put together for a bunch of countries, showing in gray the control and in red the treatment. And the bottom line is that there is really nothing to see there. That in fact, the people who receive the transfer are no more likely to stop working than the people who don't, and they work more or less the same number of hours. And this is something that you find in a form of another in various situations in rich countries, middle-income countries, poor countries. Recently, we even had an even stronger example of the fact that people aren't discouraged to work, at least in the short run, which is that in the US, shortly after, like in Europe, during the coronavirus crisis, there was an effort to do something for people who suddenly lost their livelihood in the middle of this crisis. The form that it took in the US was quite different than the form it took in France, which is that people received $600 unemployment insurance regardless of their normal earnings. So that a lot of people ended up making more while unemployed than if they found a job. So a lot of people, I'll show you some quotes in a minute, were immediately terrified that everybody was going to quit their job in order to get the insurance. If anything, the incentive to work was very, very limited in an environment where you can make more if you are unemployed than if you are employed. So this particular program was immediately studied. There is at least 6 studies, I think even 7 by now, looking at the effect of this program on labor supply. This graph is not particularly illuminating, but on the other hand, it's colorful. So I thought I put it on the graph, but I'll try to explain to you what's in it. What they did is that they separated the states by the replacement rate. So how generous is the $600 compared to what they would normally make? So the red is the highest replacement rate, and the blue is the lowest replacement rate. And the beginning of the dotted line is the beginning of the program. And you can see that, not surprisingly, the labor supply, the employment rate is lower in places that have a higher replacement rate. So these are poorer places. But when the program was put in place, it's not that these places started working less and less. In fact, if anything, starting in May, these places are converging towards the places in light blue where the replacement rate was lower. So that doesn't have to be causal, probably wasn't. But the point is that there is absolutely no prima facie case you can make that there was a massive effect of this program on labor supply. Now, that doesn't necessarily have a great implication for our understanding of labor supply. It's a very, very special circumstances. People knew it was not going to last. But it's very useful for the understanding of this particular program, which is this particular program helped really, had a huge impact on poverty, on avoiding people going into poverty, maintain the economy in a state where it was back to being, basically they didn't lose much time going back in shape as soon as the restriction lifted in the summer, and it wasn't at the cost of lower labor supply. But what happened is that as soon as the program was put in place, all of the standard ideology went back and started being at play. So the Chuck Grassley, who was the finance committee chairman, immediately said the 600 payment were poorly targeted. This discouraged people from returning to work or taking a new job, delaying the recovery, which he said with zero evidence. And in fact, when the evidence came, was going the opposite. Even more amusing, the Wall Street Journal opinion page commented on the study that I show you the graph about, titling on economists versus common sense, which is something that sometimes we could say. And so the common sense is if you pay people not to work, fewer will work, except at Yale, it seems. And he was referring to this study saying that the Yale economists don't even understand that if you pay people to work, they won't work. And unfortunately, the power of this ideology was very strong, because eventually they gave up on this payment. And in fact, they gave up on them even when they finally got to get a new package in place. The package didn't have the unemployment insurance. It had just a one-time payment of $600. And that's it. So contrary to what is happening in Europe, where somehow that the ideology is less prevalent. So this kind of was a good example of both the fact that we keep seeing all over everywhere in the book, that people are less sensitive to incentives than we would believe, and also that this is not the intuition that there should be is extremely powerful and prevalent in the public discourse and public action. The third lesson that we emphasize throughout the book is the idea that the economy is much more sticky than economists give it credit for. So economists really model the world as being a place where people move from one opportunity to the other with relatively little hindrance. So that's related to the fact that they are supposed to be particularly sensitive to the incentive, and that's related to the fact we just don't put in any like friction, any difficulties, things, pedestrian things like your friends that are in the city where you live, or someone to pick up your kids after school are not things that we usually take into account. So one thing we discuss at length is that the economy is actually extremely sticky. And with the coronavirus crisis, it's become substantially stickier. So this is pre-COVID, and this is the US. And it shows that Tocqueville used to describe the American as restless. And it turns out that they are not that restless anymore. So in 1948, 6.4% of people every year moved from county to county. And in 2016, it had gone down to 3.9%. So very few people actually move. The geographic mobility in the US, typically we say that about France, that people first tell you which village they come from and so on and so forth. But in fact, the mobility, the mobility in the US is comparably low if we look at people living from the region of origin. So that has all sorts of consequences, because if people find it difficult to move, first don't move or find it extremely costly to move, then adjustments to regional shock, for example, an industry that's laminated either by automation or by trade are extremely complicated, because people don't go, and therefore the wages go down, and that creates that further deplete demand in these places, and the places eventually collapse onto themselves. So why are people not moving? Well, in normal times, they are not moving because there are many reasons why moving is difficult. There is the cost of housing, which is in many cases people own their home, but their mortgage is more than their home. So, but at least they have a roof on their head. If they were to sell their house, they wouldn't have any money to buy a new one. The rents are also very high in places where the jobs are. So maybe you'd make some more money in New York than in North Carolina, but you would also pay much more in rent. And then there is the fact that you have insertion in your social network, in your, among your friends, and that's part of well-being, and you have someone to take care of your children. With COVID, suddenly on top of all of this sort of business as usual difficulty of moving, came this like enormous shock, particularly in the South. So first of all, as we all know, the international borders closed. So for a lot of people, moving to another country, not an option anymore. But what is perhaps well known is that even the internal migration was affected. And in fact, the internal migrant got absolutely clobbered by this. In particular, in India, the government kindly gave people 4 hours to get ready to the lockdown. What this means is that people lost their job and typically also lost their place of living, because they tend to sleep on their work site. And they didn't have any access to social protection that was offered at the time, because that's related to your village of origin. So you saw people being completely desperate. And then in the meantime, the train had stopped. So people started walking home. And then when and if they reached home, they were put in camps. And this was a really complete humanitarian nightmare at the beginning of the coronavirus lockdown. So now that the economy is humming again and people want, industries want to restart, the migrants aren't willing to go back. So already we saw relatively little migration, internal migration within many developing countries, people not really willing to leave their village to take jobs in cities. And that becomes even more true if you know that you are at the mercy of a shock like this one. And if people don't move, then that makes it even harder to survive, to adjust to shocks like climate shocks that are coming, or shocks due to trade or anything else. The first lesson we want to emphasize has to do with identity. And that's something that has become maybe particularly, I would say, heart-wrenching in the last few days, if you're American or if you have tied to America with the event of the Capitol. But in general, the pandemic has really put racial inequality into focus in the US in a way that's unprecedented. So first of all, the COVID death rates are absolutely not equal. Age adjusted, Black people die about 4 times as much as white people from COVID in the US. And that's not because they take fewer protections. I'll show you, I won't show you, but I'll discuss some studies we have done where we actually ask people what they do in terms of social distancing, mask wearing, etc. They're actually, if anything, more likely to protect themselves. So that's not about individual behavior, but that's about the job that they have. That's about the treatment that they're getting. So if there was a need for an illustration of the long shadow of racism in this country, that was a clear one. In addition, there was kind of light thrown in this haystack with the murder in quick succession of 3 unarmed African American. The last one of this series, George Floyd, on Memorial Day, so in May, when these numbers were already apparent. And that unleashed, I think, a reckoning, not so much in the Black population, but in the white population, of how much racism there was around, and a sort of, I think, an awareness that is going to last with the younger generation of the really long shadow of American history. Unfortunately, that also became part of the language, probably was always part of the language, but became more and more during the Trump presidency. The racist history also became very much an obvious part of the language of some people. So the racist element was obvious in the Capitol deck. So this is a man storming the Capitol, and what he's wearing is a Confederate flag. And this, of course, was emphasized a lot when people had commented the dispute, commented this. So some people have a sense of an America that is completely divided by racism in a way that is irretrievable. And I think what we've learned from this book is that one should never be so one should never confuse should never confuse people with what they say, in a way. That what people even describe as identity, even if they're strongly felt identity at a point in time, it doesn't necessarily reflect some deep structural preferences, perhaps because such things as deep structural preferences don't really exist. And one problem that the democratic discourse has had for many years, and that has made it very difficult to reach across and unite, which is apparently their objective now, is to essentialize the action discourse of people like this man on saying, well, they are racist. I mean, what can we do? And that goes a bit with the sort of economics idea that there are preferences, and we don't really discuss preferences. They are what they are. They are coming from deep place in people's heart or their history or their experiences. But in fact, that's not true, because there are a lot of experiments that shows that on most things, people just have very little idea what they want or what they are. And it's pretty easy to manipulate people's own sense of identity by just some very subtle cue that shouldn't really affect them if they were so enamored with their identity. And there, what I want to show you is some data we just collected this fall that show that actually people listen. And one of the great and depressing running theme in the media commentary since the beginning of the crisis is oh, everything is politicized. You know, wearing a mask is a political act, and choosing to get vaccinated is a political act, and you know, we probably started with similar opinion, but in September, we ran a large online experiment, which was our second one actually, where we showed to 10,000 Black Americans and 10,000 white Americans informational video that were recorded by Black and white doctors, giving some information on COVID-19 and mask, very simple information on, you know, masks, what you should do with COVID-19, etc. And people either got those videos or a placebo. And then we measured knowledge about COVID-19, willingness to pay for a mask, and behavior a few days after the intervention. And we had, because it was done online, we had people from everywhere, rural, urban, Republican and Democrats. And we found the things that people talk about, which is, for example, what I was telling you before, that Black Americans are as likely to wear a mask as white Americans, more likely to wear a mask than white Americans. And the Republicans are less likely to wear a mask and practice social distancing than white Americans. However, what was really striking in this experiment is that everyone was affected similarly by the experiment. If anything, proportionally, the Republicans that started from a lower level were affected a little more. So they arrived roughly at the level of the Blacks and the Democrats after the intervention. And even after the Kenosha, there was a Black man was shot in Kenosha, unfortunately not killed, but shot. And after that, there was very violent revolt for a few days. And at the time, we had a sense that it was polarizing the opinion even more. But even after Kenosha, people continued to stay just as receptive. So I think it's not true that people cannot listen to just actionable facts. And I think maybe the problem of politics is we've not given them enough actionable facts that have to do with their lives. And that relates to the last point, which is the one thing that runs is that people really care about their dignity. They don't care just about money, but they care about their place in society. They care about their status. They care about doing a job that matters. And the one thing that people, in particular, perhaps the man who was in the Capitol on the photo I showed you, feel is that they are killed by the lack of dignity. So there is this slogan, Mitch McConnell kills the poor. Mitch McConnell is a Republican leader of the Senate, and you can see that when they refuse to give the larger payout, people vandalized his door and wrote, "Where is my money?" and "Mitch kills the poor." And in some sense, they are not completely. It's partly true that the poor are being killed. If you're looking at the impact of income on mortality, you have this very, very strong relationship between how much money you are making and your sex. And that too, women live longer than men, but your household income. So you can see that the expected age at death for a 40-year-old who is in the 20th percentile is 78, and for someone who is in the, we can take the top 1%. For a woman 89, and for a man 87. So there is a huge difference in people's, just this very basic fact of just being alive between being poor and being rich. And it's not just due to race, and it's in fact mostly not due to race. And one of the factors this is coming from is the fact that that the poor and the middle class, but broadly speaking, are much more likely to die by what Anke and Angus Deaton have been calling death of despair, which is opioid overdose, suicide, gunshot wounds in over time. So between 2000 and 2014, you can see the map becoming darker and darker as these deaths of despair go up. And I reckon that we reckon these deaths of despair are coming from this kind of being robbed of dignity by the fact that nobody takes care of their financial welfare. So this was kind of the reaction to the refusal of giving them at least $2,000 to survive the COVID crisis, with this Mitch kills the poor, and also removing, having the sense that there is no opportunity to succeed in life. So where does this leave us? Well, we see that there are two opportunities from we are like glass half full kind of people. So we see two opportunities, at least from the COVID crisis. The first one is jumping on this idea that the anger that you see expressed in the Capitol, although some of the discourse might be around racial hatred, a lot of it comes from this loss of dignity, in particular coming from loss of position of love of just simple mean of existing in a dignified way. So to start with, it seems necessary, and that's true not just in the US, but in other countries as well, to start with a comprehensive reform of social protection, which involves much more generous help for people who need it: social insurance, unemployment protection, minimum guaranteed income, and that kind of things, as well as perspective for jobs. So one thing, for example, that we talk about is that more generous budget in health and in education and in care, for example, household, elderly care, etc., would create careers that would also, in addition from their direct benefit, would also create careers that will help, that will give people an option in life. And generally, it's a bit, but then we also, just going and then giving people money so that they can they have a better standard of living would be the first thing to do. And a big barrier to doing that has been this idea that, people would become lazy. And so we've done an experiment where we asked half people whether they would stop working if they had, for example, a guaranteed income, or if Medicaid came with no string attached. And in yellow, you can see the response so in purple, you can see the response that they gave about themselves. And they said, no, of course they would not stop working. Likewise, if the taxes were higher, they would not stop working. But then if you ask people what they think about other people, then they say, oh yes, those people, they would stop working. So if we live in a world where people think that they are the only one who are not responsive to incentive, then of course nobody really wants to change the system, because they don't want to be the only one paying for it. But I think what happened with the COVID crisis is that suddenly so many people needed help, and so many people got it, and in Europe in particular, in this fairly seamless way, that it might give people more willingness to experiment with this kind of seamless social protection in a more permanent way. That suddenly they might have realized that it just doesn't come just from it could really be it's not just the lazy people who need help, it's potentially everyone at some point in time for no fault of their own. That was clear in COVID, and I think that might make people realize that it's clear more generally. Once you've done that, and that's just a first step, you can go back to the question of climate change. So the US is going back to the Paris Agreement, this is a photo from California this summer, where the sky in San Francisco became orange because of the fire that were burning. So I think these fires, but also the COVID crisis itself, made people a little more aware that the catastrophe that scientists are warning could happen might in fact happen. I think the COVID made people aware that sometimes the future disaster that scientists talk about, they do happen. And that creates an opportunity for, a window of being willing to deal with climate change, but only if you can deal with the issue that Abhijit talked about at the beginning of the talk, which is the idea that people will not sacrifice the end of the world, the end of the month for the end of the world. People want to know that this is not going to be at their expense. And at the moment, because of the lack of trust in government to adequately compensate the people who would be affected directly by any measures we would take to prevent climate change, either directly or via higher gasoline prices, for example, or indirectly via mandate on cars. These people are not going to be willing to go along unless they know that they are not going to be the one paying for it eventually, and that's fair enough. And so there's no way to even go the next step on climate change, which we do need to do urgently, without starting by repairing the sense that we are willing to help the poor. So there is this is the I think both the coronavirus crisis and the Capitol attack and the fact that the Democrat control the Senate certainly made it possible in the US. So we'll see whether they succeed. If they do, I think it might be a good example for the rest of the world where those kind of dynamics are just as present, even if they are not yet expressed in terms that are quite so stark. And so let me stop here, and then we can just continue with a question answer session. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Esther and Abhijit. So let me, I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we'll have more time for the general discussion. I think you've given us a very good sense of the, what your approach in this book, where you touch on many issues, and I'm going to ask you, and on each issue, you try to illustrate how, in fact, some of the best existing research in economics is much less conservative in a way than what many people believe. And in particular, I think one point you made very clear today, and you make very clear in your book, is that this sort of obsession with financial incentives that many economists have, and many people feel economists have, in fact is very much exaggerated, and that if we look at actual behavior, as you say, it's much more sticky, well, in the sense that it's determined by many other social determinants. People care to live in a certain place with certain people, to do certain things, and they're not going to change suddenly everything they do just because you give them more money or you give them less money. So this kind of obsession with financial incentive very often prevents us from having better policies. So that's really very interesting. I want to ask you a question about international trade, which is a very important issue which you touch in your book. Before I do that, just I just want to return to the question of trust in economists. And, you know, I really want to return to this first slide that Abhijit showed us with, you know, historians getting 71% trust from the population and economists getting 25%. So as you know, my conclusion, my own conclusion from this is that, in fact, maybe we should do more history. And, you know, maybe people are, my own view is that I think, you know, people are right to some extent to trust more in historians, in the sense that on average, you know, there are exceptions, of course, but on average, historians, you know, work more on the basis of archives, of empirical evidence, and are more careful than economists about, you know, making a big conclusion, which in fact they don't know about. But I mean, you may disagree with this. You know, I know you agree to some extent, or disagree to some other extent. But my question is the following: the way you describe your work, and in a way your strategy in this book is sort of try to save the economics profession. So it's very much a book about we, the economists. You know, and my question is, are you sure, you know, this is the best way to proceed? Because, you know, there's another strategy, which is to say, okay, we are not economists or historians, you know, we want to promote, we are social scientists, we want to promote a sort of approach to social science research that uses economics, that uses history, that uses sociology. Whereas in a way, your approach is really, okay, let's save sort of economists as economists, and let's show that our profession is not what people think it is. And one difficulty with this strategy is that some people may feel it's a bit corporatist, in the sense that you're trying to save a profession as such. So should this profession, you know, be saved in the sense, is it so important to describe people as economists and you know, the kind of expert panels that Abhijit was describing at the beginning, which in practice, you know, is very homogeneous in terms of political view and view of the world in general, you know, is this really serving the right cause? And okay, so that's my sort of first question. You know, I don't know, Abhijit, Esther, whether you want to answer to this.
I'll take a shot.
Yeah.
I guess I mostly, the part that where I think disagree with you is not in that we couldn't learn a lot from historians or sociologists. It's just, I think that the particular set of disciplinary rules that every discipline adopts are useful because they allow you to focus on specific things. It's just a practice. It's a practice. And I think the economics is a good practice. History is a good practice. Sociology is a good practice. I think, but the practices are different. They focus on different things. And therefore we end up you know, learning from each of these practices. I happen to be trained in one practice. I follow that practice. I don't believe that makes me morally superior to anybody else, but it makes me, you know, I've been doing this for many years. I get good at it. I think that my argument is simply that it's a particular way of being kind of, I think, as Esther has famously said, we are plumbers, and when you open a lot of toilets, you get better at it. And I think we've been, and that's my, I think, very, but I take that seriously. I do think that particular plea for specialization is a useful one. Esther,
Okay.
you want to add?
Esther, you started as an historian, you became a plumber. What are you doing next?
Having spent a good part of my career answering the question of why what am I doing is economics, I don't feel particularly that I need to defend the economics profession as a profession. My answer was always, I don't care if it's economics. Economics, I hope it's of use. You know? And as long as an economics department or anyone is willing to pay my salary, then I'm good. So I don't think we in this book or in our career we are advocate for economics. It's more we are loudspeakers for economics. In fact, a lot of people, when reading this book, say, oh, you are so critical of the profession of economics. So most people read it the opposite way you read it. And I think you're closest to the truth in that because you know the profession better. And
know us better.
But so we are, but I don't think we are kind of either really advocates or critics. We are trying to say what it is that people do today. And both to, but not particularly because we want to regain credibility for the field. That would be a bit, that's not sufficient to go through so much effort of writing a book. So it's because this particular message of economics doesn't really get across. And in particular, if you're looking at our dear leaders, their notion of economics, it's very, very, very economics 101. And therefore they think they know economics, but they don't, because they know economics 101, and they are full of this intuition, and they think it's based on I think they think it's based on some expertise, but it's not, because the expertise says the opposite. So, for example, they think that one should not be too generous to the poor because that would perpetuate poverty, although there is no evidence for it. But so in that sense, that's more the public that we are looking for. It's not policymakers, not the only public we're looking for, but that's more what we are aiming to say. It seems similarly when you think about migration, and people feel threatened by migration. They sort of think it's, very intuitive economics that, first of all, everybody wants our lives because it's so much better. So many people want to come. And second of all, when they come, the wages are going to go down because, plus on est fou, moins y a de riz. That's like the economics everyone knows. And so we have to, what we are trying to argue there is, look, actually economics doesn't say that. The correct reasoning doesn't matter if it happens to be called economics, but that's the correct reasoning, and the empirical evidence doesn't show that. It turns out that we are talking from this discipline, and we are less, despite my past, our historical culture is less good than yours, but we would, but even without the benefit of that, it's easy to debunk a lot of what people think they think based on the economics they think they know. So that's even without going all the way to doing even better by incorporating these insights, you can already
Okay, let me ask you one quick question about international trade. I think that's very important because that's one of the issues on which there's really a big gap between what economists typically the profession thinks. So Abhijit told us at the beginning, no economist at all in the panel wanted tariff as a welfare improving policy, and of course the public opinion is very skeptical about this, or at least large segments of the public opinion are skeptical, and this is probably the one issue on which Trump sort of managed to get elected in a way against the Democrat. One of the biggest issues, and sort of convince part of the public opinion that he will protect American workers in a way that Democrat globalists will never do. Now, in your book, you actually show some evidence. You present some research that is sometimes goes against the sort of free trade, set of beliefs of economists. So, in particular, there's this famous research by, I think she was one of your students, Topalova, on trade liberalization in India. Showing that the districts and states in India which liberalized trade less, which were less exposed to trade liberalization, more precisely after 1991, in fact, had a faster reduction in poverty, and those who were more exposed to trade liberalization had a less reduction in poverty. So in a way, it's sort of very negative against the trade liberalization. So short question, what do you take from this in terms of what will be the right policy? So you mentioned, trade assistance program in your book, but in concrete terms, does that mean that in certain cases, for certain industry, you will support tariff, you will support some change in the trade agreement where we will put some condition on wages from importing, exporting country. And so what would you recommend in practice?
Oh, you're muted.
Oh, Abhijit, we don't hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what would we recommend? I think first order, I think we recommend that the economists take their own doctrine seriously. The doctrine doesn't say that people are made better off by trade if you do nothing about it. It says people are made better off by trade when you compensate the loser. So I think there are situations where that even that is probably not enough. There are situations where I think there is been, I mean, there's a long line of work showing that there are situations where trade can be actually bad for even the GDP. But I think the first order question, I think at least in the context of the US and most other places and of Petia's work, is simply that what trade does often is distributes very small benefits to lots of people at the cost of a very large cost to some people. And I think that particular view means that we need to be, since we are, especially if we think our redistributive regimes are extremely inept, which they often are, and politically frozen, then we should take very seriously whether a particular is the benefits of reducing tariffs on these kinds of shoes that much uh, worth the pain it's going to cause to particular set of shoemakers. So I think it's both. It is partly a question of how much we think that the redistributive regimes are going to be responsive to these things. What's striking is that we have almost, as a profession, we've almost never complained about this issue. That we haven't said, look, we are supported free trade, but on the understanding that losers will be compensated. They were almost never compensated. How could that possibly be then? Why aren't we out shouting that this is terrible way to use economics? I think that to me is there are many failures, but this is probably one of the most salient ones.
I'll add something on the question of using tariff to promote an objective. In a sense, you're saying, well, we could have a trade agreement that are conditional on some practices, could be labor practice, environmental practices, etc. That's actually, I mean, that's done from time to time, and so there, I think I would separate, I would distinct what when Trump put it in a new NAFTA.
Mm-hmm.
You got a bit of a conflating, of a mix-up, of mashup of two issues. One is protecting the American workers, and the other is protecting the Mexican workers. So there was an insistence on paying high wage in Mexico, mostly to prevent the export of cheap care to the US. It seems to me it might be a little easier to separate the two issues and say the protection of the American worker is the job of the job of the redistribution system, and because the American worker and the Mexican worker might not, it might not be that the thing that is good for American worker is also good for the Mexican worker. Maybe Mexico less than if you think Vietnam, like imposing the same minimum wage in Vietnam as in the US, in order, that would be just terribly unfair for Vietnam. So I think it's best to think about these things separately and to say, on the one hand, once we have trade agreements, we know that it's going to make victims in both set of countries because of these frictions, and therefore we need to have policies that helps them, which are not in place today. Today, the trade adjustment assistance in the US is a joke. It's like pays like cents in compensation to the affected worker. And the second part is, okay, can there be something, can we use trade politics, trade as a way to enforce some goals? And there, why not? It's not, trivial because it involves there are more than one countries, but it is something that, for example, one of our students is working on the palm oil industry. We're saying that if you can absolutely not, if Indonesia is unable to regulate its palm oil industry, then the EU can put a tariff on Indonesian palm oil coming from bad plantation, and that's going to help achieve that objective under some conditions. So I think it shouldn't be put out of the table, and it's not. But we can think of the two separately. For example, if you're thinking about minimum wage in Vietnam, I don't think I would be against trade agreement that would have minimum wage conditions, but they would not be at the place that makes the Vietnam worker not competitive with the US worker. That's all.
Okay, Olivia, I think we should move to the general question. So do you want to take it from now?
Sure. So we can start with this question. What are the differences between you three about how you see the state should or could increase its incomes to spend more on social policies? Suggestion, increase its debt, taxing more the rich. What are your views on it?
It's probably the place where we disagree the least, which is that there should be, we're probably more closest on the answer to the question of, or to the answer taxing the rich. I don't know. I mean, maybe Thomas has disagrees, but I think we probably disagree more on many other things.
I don't know. Yeah. What do you think we disagree about? I'm sure there are lots of things.
History, whether economic theory is useful at all.
Okay.
I think we disagree on more things than that. On the fact that the rich, we should tax the hell out of the rich. I don't think that's not where we have the biggest disagreement.
Well, I mean, yeah, there are many different ways to do it, and you can always do it more than
yeah, but mostly we learned about what those ways are from you. So I don't think we have a independent view that's not guided by you on that particular issue.
So Thomas, maybe you want to give a few ideas on how you think any state could finance such social and public policies?
Well, no, I'm not sure I want to do that. I think because I'm sure there are other questions, but just maybe to this particular question, let me answer. I don't know if it's on behalf of Esther and Abhijit, but I think one of the big lessons on social spending from the book of Esther and Abhijit and their research in general is that sometimes the social program have to be sort of very it's not paternalistic, but they should not leave too much choice. They should not rely too much on financial incentive. When we know that we have a good vaccine or a good medicine for to have clean water, etc. Which sometimes things have to be automatic, and I think it goes very much against some of the obsession of economists for you always need to give more choice and sophisticated incentive, and I think that's a very, very important lesson which is when we think about social spending in general.
Thank you.
Just to add, maybe one point is
sure.
Just to add to that, one reason why we didn't spend, we talk a little bit about raising money. For example, the tax to GDP ratio in the US is 25%. There is a lot of scope to raise more money if they wanted to. But we don't talk much about it because that's there's nothing we have to say that's particularly original. But what we felt was not talked about much is once you have the money, how do you spend it? And also that it was very important to go against the worry that people have that any money you might raise from taxes would be wasted in wasteful government spending, and the government is the problem, not the solution, and so on and so forth. And one way to raise more money is to create some more consensus around the idea that more money should be raised by by making it clear that A, we need the government as societies, and B, we need comprehensive social policies of the kind that Thomas just talked about, or of you know, generous unemployment insurance, training for people, jobs that maybe nobody is willing to pay for, but have a lot of social values, and so on and so forth. So we're kind of our job is to spend the money once someone else has managed to raise it, and to show that it can be spent very usefully on the poorest.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a few questions regarding policymakers. How can we expand policymakers' knowledge beyond economics 101? And what would be the one piece of advice that you would give to a policymaker who hasn't read your book?
Abhijit.
You go for it.
No, you do.
You've been advising policymakers day and night.
You go ahead. Go and advise.
What's the one piece of advice? I would say, I think most policymakers actually, there's high-level policymakers who do a lot of damage sometimes, but I think there's a lot of policymakers who actually operate at the level of details. And I think at that point, I think the thing to tell them is that neither your intuition nor some economic theory is going to guide you. I think it's really, you have to try things, and details matter a lot, and design matters a lot. So I guess this is what we do in JPAL, is to emphasize that you can't, the general principles only take you so far. So I would have probably, if I had to add one thing to tell them, I would say, forget about whatever economics 101 told you is not going to help you very much, because it's so much of a general principles, which one way or the other are not that useful. Esther, you want to add?
Thank you very much. We have another question on a topic that's been discussed a lot. Do you think the trust in economists will increase in the following years?
Well, if you make a prediction like economists make about the economy, that's a bit...
I was just going to say we've made a lifetime refusing to make predictions. We've made a career out of this particular avoiding such question, like, do you think X will happen in the future? So on this one, that would really require a crystal ball. Who knows? I don't see what has changed so much. I mean, it's not, I don't see what would suddenly give us more play, but what not? Who not? Things change. I
think we have some young people listening. They are great. They'll make a better economics.
Oh yeah, that's for the longer future. That I have high hopes for the longer future. I was more thinking. I thought the question was more like in the next.
6 months.
In the coming years.
Also, I mean, let me try another answer, which brings me to my first question to you, which is, I think the problem is that, of course, the term economist, will always be used by all sorts of people, lots of economists in the banking sector, etc. And I think it's going to be difficult, to increase trust in this profession with this kind of with this word to refer to this profession. And so that was a little bit my question initially. Maybe you have to invent. It's not easy, because my solution, when I say, we should be social scientists, okay, maybe that's too general, that's too broad. And so do we have to be socio-economists? Do we have to invent new words? I mean, the words are important, and economist is a complicated word, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to save it, no matter what you do. So this doesn't make me very optimistic about the question that was just asked.
Econo-plumber.
Okay, now the term plumber, I know why you use this term, and I can understand, but I think in a way, there are difficulties also with this term because it looks a bit nihilistic in the sense to some people, in the sense that it says also that we cannot talk about sort of the big systemic issues. And, you know, of course, it's difficult to talk about the big systemic issue, but at the same time, you know, we have historical evidence again, and you know, even though it will never be, you know, randomized, controlled experiment, we are not going to replace the 20th century without progressive taxation, without etc. But yeah, so Plumber is so eco Plumber, yeah, socio-economist. I think.
Okay, we will work on it. I think that this is. I take your point. I think you're right. That it's hard to people have a particular association. It's hard to live it down.
We have another question. What do you think about the possibility to have in the same time GDP growth and energy transition? What do you think about the importance to have alternative indicators? And just adding that after you reply to this question, Lucas might add something as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's something that we really take on in the book, and trying to say that basically the reliance almost exclusively on GDP as a measure of the points in the competition of nations has been extremely pernicious. That has led countries to try all sorts of experiments in order to get the higher GDP. And it's not only GDP level that that the countries are targeting, but GDP growth. And so it tries, you know, it's really the fear of lowering growth that led that kind of was one of the factors that propelled the Reagan revolution. And it's because they didn't want to be like, they were worried they would go below Europe. The on a completely different set of mistakes, the fear of GDP growth in Japan led Japanese to try all sorts of interesting experiments, building bridges to nowhere, etc., in order to continue to fuel the economy. Even though in both countries, they actually were starting from very prosperous economies where they had already a lot of welfare going around, and they could improve standard of being by doing other things than trying to target the growth. So just from the and then on top of that, if you add the environmental damage that goes with some version of growth, then it really becomes completely, one cannot justify using GDP as the only measure of success, or even as an important one. Now, the question of can you have GDP growth and energy transition? I think the question is quite different in poor and in rich countries. In rich countries, you might, and then you might not. I think there is a lot of hope among economists that that we'll be able to have our cake and eat it by transitioning to energy, to clean economy that are going to drive out the market by becoming cheap enough, and therefore we can get both things. That's kind of very much the spirit of the Stern report. It might be a little over optimistic, and it might be that we just need a little bit less growth in order to not destroy the planet in the process. In the poor countries, I think the trade-offs are very different, because poor countries are poor. People really need more. They need more money. They need more money to get everything that they need to live better. And there is the possibility of leapfrogging some of the dirty technologies they might have in order to have this growth in a clean way, but it's going to cost money, and we will need international solidarity for this to happen. And we owe it to the world, because most of the climate change is our fault, and most of the effect of climate change it's experienced in poor countries. So there is really, we really need to come up with something that does not depend on charity or on the particular political equilibrium at a moment or another for the rich country to finance energy transition in the poor country without sacrificing their growth. What we've seen during the COVID crisis, and the fact that basically the rich country really didn't get around to help out in any significant measure the poorer country at the scale that should have been necessary should really give us pause and make us think like we really better start thinking about how to organize the financing of the energy transition in poor country now before we are really facing a disaster, because then we will be so focused on our own navel that we will be unable to do anything significant.
Thank you very much. I think Lucas Chancel also wanted to share some perspective on this question.
Thanks, Olivia. Hello, Abhijit. Hello, Esther. Actually, Esther just essentially answered the question, but to take it on from what has already been said on climate change and poverty, perhaps my question would be, in developing countries where a big part of the story is going to be to develop, large-scale infrastructures that are low carbon with large-scale public investments. How do you see the role of the randomized controlled trials in this effort to basically develop in a low carbon world, and how do we connect the RCT learning by doing approach with the timing imperative, and the fact that a lot of it is going to be a lot, as has been said before, a lot of huge investments in infrastructures. How do you see this from your perspective?
So the danger in the climate change, or it's a bit more of a danger, it's a temptation in the climate change world, is to assume that the problem is mainly there are political problems in terms of funding the money, etc. But then the problem is mainly a technical one. And if we can get the right technologies and deploy them in the right way, we're good to go. And unfortunately, I don't think that's true in the sense that there is going to be, so obviously it's a part of the problem. So there is a lot of the work that has to be done to develop the technologies, to roll them out, to finance them, and so on and so forth. Which leads us, brings me back a bit to the debate between Abhijit and Thomas a bit earlier. I don't think all economists should be plumber. I've never argued that. My argument is some economists should do plumbing some of the time, which is a much smaller claim. And that's true as well in climate change, which is some people need to be taking care of behavior, and that the infrastructure investment, the technology changes, they are not going to be enough. The technology will need to be adopted in a consistent way, and that's not given. It's never given. And in rich countries, we are going to need to change behavior, and that requires, understanding what will make people change their behavior, and that's also not a given. And all of these are places where there is scopes for RCTs. So not the entire question can be dealt with by RCT, obviously, but there are a lot of aspects that can.
Thank you very much. Given the time, I think that we should close the debate. Unfortunately, we couldn't take all the questions, but thank you very much, everyone, for showing so much interest. And thank you very much, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, for your time and for explaining so much about your book. It was a very exciting debate. Thomas, maybe you want to add something before?
No. Well, thanks a lot, Esther and Abhijit. And yeah, we hope that during your time in Paris this year and in the future, we'll have more opportunities to have, real conferences whenever this is possible in the coming months and weeks. But in the meantime, of course, we'll try to get you to this Zoom seminar and conferences as much as we can without the usual jet lag that we have with you. So thanks a lot for being here. I have nothing to add, so I think we can.
The replay of the debate will be available on our website next week, and we'll share it on the social media. And the program for the next debates are on our website as well, which is wid.world, wid.world. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you on February the 9th.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.